Pure Pasty is focused on keeping customers happy, offering British traditions for American taste buds.
This week we had the Philly cheesesteak because of the Super Bowl. And then we have the buffalo chicken also for the Super Bowl.
And when you're with the upper crust of pasties, there's one last thing to do. This is the first time I've had a pasty since moving to the United States. So let's see what a world beater tastes like.
That's so good.
Owen Fairclough. Cgtn, feeling rather homesick in Virginia.
I want to bring in my colleague Nathan King and our guest Kevin Matthews. He's an assistant professor of history at George Mason University. And Kevin, I want to start with you because you were on this broadcast back in October and you had a great line. You said that Brexit is sort of like the Eagles song, Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. We're about a half hour away, maybe even less. It looks like leaving is actually going to happen. Well, we got to have a new song, I suppose.
Well, Boris Johnson might think he's leaving the EU, but he's not really. He's just beginning the phase of the transition, going into talks, and those will start at the end of February, and he thinks they're going to be done by the end of December, but virtually no one else does.
And Nathan, you brought along a little prop here.
My British passport. Feeling a little lighter this evening, I can tell you.
So what do you make of this?
I think Kevin's quite right. As Winston Churchill once said, it's not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning when it comes to the relationship with Europe. And there is a big trade deal to be negotiated with the EU. But that is everything. The relationship with the EU defines what's going to happen with the US and the UK. It's going to define what happens with China and the UK. So, you know, it's a bit like the mafia. Every time you think you're out, they pull you back in, right? and this has actually been the UK's relationship, and you know, I'm a student of history, with the European continent for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that you have this love-hate, schizophrenic relationship where one moment you're in, one moment you're out. The British Empire, yes, but Napoleon's trying to control the continent. Let's get in. Same with Nazi Germany. But you can date this back hundreds and hundreds of years. And there is still this sort of schizophrenic attitude in the British Isles and elsewhere in Northern Europe too. You know, we could talk about the Scandinavian countries, about continental Europe. So a lot of people are focusing on the last 3 years, and I understand that. But it's also to do with geography, culture, and everything else as well.
Kevin, it's so interesting because this whole vote was pretty simple, in or out. But it's complicated, and we're talking about that with the exit, the transition period. Trade deals generally take years to hammer out, and it's a lot of back and forth. Now they're kind of, there's vice grips involved here. This has to be kind of negotiated in a short period of time.
Yeah, that was the problem, and David Cameron, when he proposed this referendum, never really thought it through, and the Brexiters never really thought it through. Donald Tusk, the then president of the EU Commission, said after the 2016 referendum that there should be a special place in hell reserved for those who proposed this referendum because they didn't have any idea what they would do afterwards. I don't think the Brexiteers ever really thought they were going to win that referendum. And so now they've had to play it on the hoof. It is significant that the EU has been readying for this for months. They held seminars with 200 diplomats to begin their negotiations starting at the end of February, beginning of March. And it looks as if Boris Johnson is going to send a contingent of maybe 30 to Brussels to negotiate. So they're already starting from a very weak position. And they never thought that the EU would hold together the way they did. They thought at first they could separate the 27, and what they found to their surprise in London is that they all stuck together.
Yeah, I
agree. Talked about Donald Tusk. Let's talk about the other Donald that you cover on a daily basis, Donald Trump. And he's been a big cheerleader, a supporter of this. But he's not a great guy to negotiate with either. And if he feels like he's got all the cards, so talk to me about working out a trade deal with the United States.
Yeah, can I just go back a bit? Because remember the previous president, Barack Obama, I know it feels like 20 years ago, but he was criticized when he said, you know, if the UK left the European Union, they would have to get to the back of the queue, see the English word, not line, for a trade deal. And everyone thought that basically David Cameron, the Prime Minister, then had put that word into Obama's mouth to sort of discourage this idea of a voting leave. Now it's completely the opposite. In fact, I have never seen a US president, perhaps outside of wartime, weigh in on domestic issues in the United Kingdom like Donald Trump. And if you look at his close advisors like Stephen Bannon early on, they were essentially trying, not just in the UK, but in Italy, in Greece and elsewhere, to essentially destroy the European Union from within. That's essentially what people have been saying. Now, I'm not saying the US did that with the UK, but there was definitely a cheerleader on the other side of the Atlantic. But it's delivery time now for Donald Trump, because if you say, leave, it's so much better if you're outside, we'll have a free trade agreement, but then you start saying, don't deal with Huawei, eat our chlorinated chicken, New York's going to be the center of the financial universe, that's not going to fit well with the British people.
Kevin, to that point, we heard one of the guests from London say that the UK now entering a big, tough world, and Boris Johnson also trying to prepare the folks in the UK for this, saying, admittedly, there will be bumps in the road. So talk about those bumps in the road. I mean, he's alluded to it, you have as well. How difficult is it going to be to navigate this terrain? And to Nathan's point, you don't want to alienate China because you want as many friends as possible now because you're out there alone, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors that Boris Johnson's going to have to take into consideration when he goes into trade talks, not just with the EU, but with Donald Trump and also with China. But I think that if the British think that they're somehow going to replace the trade that they've had with the EU, with the United States, and with China, they're living in a fantasy world. Something like 53% of the UK imports come from the EU. 58% of the UK exports go to the EU. Now compare that with the United States. Only 13% of the UK's exports go to the US, and the UK only imports 14%. When it comes to China, very quickly, when it comes to China's export, UK exports to China, they're only between 3.5% to 5%. You can't make up those numbers. They just don't add up.
Kevin's got such a great point here, because for I'm not going to give away my age, but essentially the entire time the UK has been in the European Union has been my life. And what's happened, it's not just economic, it's cultural. We all go on vacation in France, in Spain, people buying second homes in Estonia, can you believe it, in Poland. So what's really happened is a cultural integration. So you've also got this huge affinity for each other's products, people moving from Poland to the UK. So what's happened is, as well as the big stuff like cars and aeroplanes, which are spread over Europe by European policy. So what's essentially happened is you have this codependent relationship. It's a marriage, albeit with 28 countries, 27 today. And this is totally underestimated by the British public. It's not because they're stupid or it's because they're ill-informed. Because the entire debate over leaving the EU, and we've heard our colleagues in London talk about, you know, take back control and how wonderful that was in terms of selling Brexit, but it didn't educate the public of what's next. And your figures put that into perspective, that basically half of your exports and half of your imports come from this bloc you are leaving. It is a divorce. And when you divorce, you have to give up half the house, right?
Or the whole house.
Oh, the whole house and the kids.
Yeah.
And, you know, and you go through all your stuff. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And you've also got both sides laying down markers. They say they want to have smooth negotiations. But already today, Michael Gove was saying that when it comes to things like fishery rights, the UK is going to claim up to 200 miles of ocean around the UK. Well, the UK between Calais and Dover is only 21 miles. So is he going to claim fishing rights up to Paris? I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
And this is so silly too. Could I tell you, I did a podcast the other day with someone for our heat show. And he was saying like fishing is like 0.1% of the entire economy, but it's the symbolism, you know, it's our sea, it's our fish. And this is where the problem lies. Nationalism takes over from empiricism, which is essentially saying what's good for us, what is good for everyone else. You know, Chinese like to use the phrase win-win. Everyone's lose-lose here.
Fascinating discussion, and we'll continue it, but right now we're going to send it back to London as our special coverage Brexit, A New Era continues with my colleague, Jamie Owen.
Mike, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome back to Westminster. Britain's departure from Europe is taking place under the terms of a deal struck between the EU and the UK in October. Naweed Jabarkal has been taking a closer look at the details of that divorce.
So what was actually in that Brexit divorce agreement? The deal provided for a transition during which the UK is no longer represented in EU institutions, but stays in the single market and the customs union and subject to EU rules. The transition lasts until the end of this year, unless both sides agree to extend it. Like any divorce, it does include a financial settlement under which the UK agrees to pay off its remaining contributions to the EU budget. That's estimated at about $45 billion, but it will go up if the transition period is extended. There is also protection for the rights of the 3.2 million EU nationals living in the UK, as well as the 1.3 million British citizens living in other EU states. But they may need to apply for resident status, and future freedom of movement is still up in the air. The main difference from Theresa May's failed agreement is how it deals with Northern Ireland, which will stay in the UK's customs territory but will also be partly aligned to the single market. That's to ease trade across its southern border with the Republic of Ireland.
Nui Jabaka reporting. So, as we've been hearing, Brexit is not straightforward for the nations that make up the United Kingdom. England and Wales voted for Brexit, but Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain in the EU. Against their wishes, they will now be taken out of Europe. We'll hear from our correspondent Andrew Wilson on Northern Ireland's border with the Republic of Ireland in just a few moments. First, let's take you to Scotland and our correspondent Holly Hudson, who joins us now live from Edinburgh. Holly, like it or not, Scotland is leaving along with the rest of the United Kingdom. I'm guessing more of a vigil than a celebration there tonight?
Yes, certainly, Jamie. It's more commiserations here than celebrations because, of course, Scotland is a country that voted overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the EU. 62% of people here voted to remain, and that increased in number here in Edinburgh. In the capital, 74% of here back to remain. So that sort of explains really why there's a more sombre sort of mood, a more bleak outlook on Brexit here. People have been laying flowers, lighting candles. There's even a campaign urging people to light a candle, leave a light on for Scotland, because there's a sense here of sort of hope that Scotland will at some point rejoin the EU. And we've heard messages to that effect from nationalist politicians in government today. Earlier I spoke to the MSP for Edinburgh, the SNP's Europe Minister, Ben McPherson. Here's what he had to say.
European Union is an organisation that's expansive. It wants to grow. It wants to bring more people into this really important multilateral organisation where independent member states come together and work together on shared challenges like climate change, on shared aspirations like remaining competitive in a world that's only becoming more challenging. And Scotland has a lot to bring to that project. It has a lot of good to contribute, and the European Union has been warm in its empathy for the fact that Scotland looks like tonight, it will tonight, be dragged out of the European Union against our will. We don't want that to happen. We want to be in the European Union, and we will find our way back.
So, Holly, will extracting Scotland from the EU, I wonder, increase support for Scottish independence from the United Kingdom?
Well, the Scottish National Party, who are in government here, are certainly hoping so, because their goal, of course, is to win independence, win an independence referendum, and then eventually rejoin the EU. The latest polls suggest that the SNP, there is a backing for independence, that more people would support it for the first time since 2015. And of course, the referendum 6 years ago, 55% of people here rejected independence. The Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, say much has changed since then. There's been a material change in circumstances, how they put it, in the form of Scotland being dragged out of the EU against its will, and that justifies, they say, a second referendum. Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, laying out her plans today, promising to ramp up the campaign to try and woo round those Remain supporting voters here to the idea of independence, because she knows, of course, that without their backing, without more support, there's no way that she can convince Boris Johnson, who has so far ruled out an independence referendum, and without the consent of the British government, a legally binding vote can't take place here.
Holly Hudson in Edinburgh in Scotland, thank you very much for that. Andrew Wilson is in Warren Point for us tonight, one of Northern Ireland's busiest ports on the border with the Republic of Ireland. Andrew, I guess there, more than anywhere, highlights the challenge of how Brexit plays out in real terms.
The challenge runs deep here, Jamie. A much more muted response than you might have found, for example, in Scotland. But people here are just left with that sense generally that they're not sure what's going to happen next, and they're not sure what they're going to have to do about it. Now, there was some relief a few months ago when they realised that the land border was not going to be the focus of the issue with separation from the European Union, that it was going to become across the Irish Sea that there was going to be an issue. But that affects ports like Warren Point, $6 billion of trade every year, cement, steel, timber, agricultural products going between here and the UK, here and the European Union, and further beyond to the Americas. Now they're starting to think, what does regulatory alignment mean? Who's going to be responsible for marking the provenance of all our goods? Are we going to have to set up a customs post? Are we going to have to change our paperwork procedures? All these questions swimming around, and as you spend more time here, you realise just how far away Northern Ireland is from Westminster. It's stuck between two camps. It's the membership of one community, but it's the neighbour of a much closer one.
The morning milk rolls off the Carlingford ferry, a regular short crossing that's about to get controversial.
Your man's dead on, or is he going back off again? No, they're coming off, darn yet.
Because it happens to run between Ireland and the UK.
So we just carry on going, yeah. Just carry on going, that's it, yeah. That's all we can do, so it is, so, yeah. I don't know if it'll have much of an effect or not. I don't think it will, to be honest with you, like, so we just keep on doing our job.
But for the haulage companies, the Brexit deadline offers only uncertainty. Possible customs checks means drivers' overtime and lots more paperwork. But so far, no confirmation. Small wonder the freight associations here are asking for government support.
If you miss your booking slot, you're in trouble. It adds hours to us, which has cost us, driver, not getting reloads. So anything that slows down a process of what we have at the moment is going to have a financial impact on our business.
But the Brexit front line will be fish. Here in Kilkeel, resentment runs deep against EU quotas. The trawlers may expect UK control of the fisheries, but for sure Brussels will fight for continued EU access to these waters and will leverage other deals against fishing rights.
Britain may have the fish, but Europe has the restaurant tables. So in the next few months, whenever Westminster pushes for deals on financial services or banking, Brussels will push back for more concessions at sea. The papers are already calling it fish for finance.
Well, like, where do you end? If we don't get access to your fishing grounds, we're going to stop you selling your fish to Europe. Okay, well, if you do that, we'll stop buying French wine. This industry, probably more than any industry, is unique. We see opportunities from Brexit. Clearly there's challenges, but the opportunities outweigh the challenges. We've had a lot of challenges down through the years. We could recite those to them blue in the face, but we have proven our resilience, and we will prove it again.
Down the road, Clonallen is a small firm making bespoke medical kits for hospital theatres in Ireland and the UK.
Squares you see there are surgical gauze swabs. These are lollipop sticks that they will use.
Clonallen boss Dermot Dempster has been busy. He's set up a second facility south of the border, ready for EU demand, and he's registered for EU compliance to certify his products for export into the European Union. It's been hard work, but in his view, it's all about survival.
It can look like that, but I mean everybody's going to be affected by this. You know, there's not a company on the island of Ireland that will not be affected in some shape or fashion. So we've got to be professional about this. We've got to work through it and come out the other side, and I think we will do that.
The clock is now ticking, and Northern Ireland faces potentially turbulent times. But because of where it is, between Great Britain and Ireland, it's no stranger to change, and as a result brings a history of resilience to the challenges ahead.
Well, that warning you saw there in my report from Dermot Dempster, that rings true for a lot of companies here. They know the EU very well here because of their proximity, just 100 metres that way to the Republic of Ireland. They have a lot of relationships already with the European Union in the Republic of Ireland. Their clients are telling them, look, there's trouble ahead. We're going to have to sort out regulatory authorities. We're going to have to sort out the paperwork. We're going to have to work out whether there's different duties to pay on different products. And as that chap I interviewed there, Dermot Dempster, said, the companies that have thought about this are getting prepared for the end of this year, but some are taking a wait-and-see approach, what some authorities here are calling burying their heads in the sand. And those companies may face real difficulties in 12 months' time once it becomes real exactly what Westminster has negotiated on their behalf. Back to you, Jamie.
Andrew Wilson on the Irish border, thank you very much. We're going to stop talking about Brexit for 10 seconds because I just want to bring you some breaking news from the United States. We're hearing US President Donald Trump is set to be acquitted in his impeachment trial after senators there voted against calling witnesses or admitting new evidence. So that breaking news in the last few moments. President Trump is set to be acquitted in his impeachment trial after senators voted against calling witnesses or admitting new evidence. Much more on that breaking story during the course of the coming hours, of course, here. You're watching CGTN live from Westminster on the night Britain leaves the EU. Coming up later in the show, crowds gathering opposite Parliament to mark the moment of Brexit. We will bring it all to you live as it happens. And we will also look back at the UK's troubled relationship with the rest of our European neighbours over 47 years of membership.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Westminster. So we are into the last 5 minutes of Britain's membership of the EU. On the stroke of midnight, Brussels time, that's 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. in London, the UK will leave. The countdown clock projected onto the wall of number 10 Downing Street, the London home of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, now counts down the last minutes to a new chapter. Meanwhile, in Brussels, the Union flag was taken down a little earlier today. Its destination, a museum in Brussels. So Britain, in the last moments of membership of the EU, in these final minutes of January, a new month and a new story is about to begin. The month of January, Boris Johnson would tell us, in Latin, takes its name from Janus, the god of new beginnings and transitions in Roman mythology, if my history serves me right. I think Janus was usually depicted as having two faces, since he looks to the future and to the past. Perhaps nothing could be more appropriate for this moment for Britain. Gitto Harry is with me, a former advisor to Boris Johnson, and Helen Thomas, who worked in the building next door as an advisor to the former finance minister, George Osborne. We're watching the crowds just over the river from us now, who are counting down and watching the minutes tick away. Gitto, you've been with Boris Johnson on those big moments of his political career. You know him. How will he be viewing these kind of scenes? How will he take this in? How will he absorb it?
He is, to use a sporting analogy, a big game player. He loves these big moments. He rarely has any nerves at all. At the Beijing Olympics, the biggest thing that I was involved in with him, he stepped out into the stadium in Beijing, billions of people around the world watching, not even a shred of nerves. He will think that this is his destiny, that he has helped bring it about. It's about to happen. He is projecting the kind of optimism that we need to get through, whether it's misguided or not. And he obviously hopes to carry the country with him in due course.
Helen, you've worked in Downing Street, this extraordinary historic place that's seen so many changes and chances and so many chapters of British history. It's an extraordinary warren, isn't it? It's a peculiar place.
It's a home and an office and a piece of history. And so therefore, yes, a very strange place for all of those reasons.
There's a good crowd here in London. It's been a rather miserable night, really. It's been extremely cold, as perhaps you would expect in January. It's rained a fair old bit, but that crowd has turned out tonight. Many of them are regulars, many of them protesters who've turned up here for months and months.
They've been there for years.
They've been here for years, some of them. We know some of them by name.
Yeah.
But you're now watching live on Cgtn the countdown on the front of Downing Street, a historic moment as the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. Inside, Boris Johnson and his closest advisors. And we will stay with those pictures now as we watch this extraordinary chapter end and another chapter begin.
Bit of a cheer going up.
A big cheer goes up from Westminster. And you're seeing Big Ben projected onto the front of Downing Street. And a recording of Big Ben, because we should tell you that the building behind us, at the centre of all this, is under repair. And the bells themselves are not operative, but I think you get the picture, those crowds cheering. And in the far distance, you probably won't be able to hear it, but we can hear from our perch on the other side of the river, fireworks sounding on the other side of London. Nigel Farage, behind the fireworks, can barely contain his glee. What we won't see is Boris Johnson. He has no plans, we understand, to talk to the crowds tonight. We've seen and heard from him, Gitto.
Yes, and a very sober address, very conciliatory address. He knows that people are feeling sore. He knows that he's been right at the heart of this, and a lot of people felt that he'd behaved badly, that he created a situation with dubious motives, but he's seen it through. He promised in a general election to resolve this, to break the impasse, to get Brexit done. He's got it done. This is a big moment, but he doesn't want to gloat. He's very wisely staying under covers, and what you will see, I think, after a few days when we've all absorbed this, is when he comes back for air, he'll be talking about all kinds of other things, cutting crime, investing in British infrastructure, major announcement on railways due next week, and a sort of evidence, he hopes, that other parts of the world now are looking to trade with us, are looking to take advantage of the freedom that we have, to think outside the box, to be more agile perhaps, to be more vibrant, to be more creative, to do things differently. Because one of the reasons, again, apart from the psychology and the philosophy that we've discussed, one of the drivers of Brexit is this sense that Europe is not where it's at anymore. It's in China, it's in Japan, it's in the Far East, it's in Latin America. So why should Britain that has the English language, that has the Greenwich Central Zone in terms of, you know, how the world tells time, that has a history of an empire and then a commonwealth and innovation and all the rest of it. Why should we be lumbered and held back by a bureaucracy in Brussels, not free to go and embrace these more exciting parts of the world that are doing things differently and are ahead of the game?
We are watching pictures of a huge crowd in the centre of London singing God Save the Queen. We've seen Nigel Farage on stage, and perhaps a moment to talk about him. It's often said that individuals can't make much impact in politics, but my goodness, this man, Nigel Farage, has had a profound impact on British politics, indeed on European politics.
Absolutely. I was just thinking that as we watched him there, just this one man, as the fireworks were going off all around him, what a change he has made by getting the topic of Europe and Euroscepticism high up on the agenda, and as well cleverly using all the tools that he could to drive that agenda for, frankly, I think, good 30 years, to be honest, you know, to get to this point. And as you say, in a way that should be inspirational for everybody, whether or not you may or may not like him or his politics or what he stands for. It does show you can make a difference if you try.
And let's talk about the other central figure in this extraordinary story. It is, of course, Boris Johnson, your former boss. Tell us what he's like. You worked with him, you know him. What is he like as a man, as a politician?
He thinks in terms of historical change. He is extremely well read. He studied ancient history and the classics at university. He reads precociously. Even as somebody with an awful lot on his plate, he's never without a book that's on the go. He thinks a lot, he devours newspapers. At one point he started learning Mandarin because he had a brother at Beijing Business School, and having visited, he just thought that he needed to know more about that exciting part of the world. So he thinks in big technicolor. He's often sort of accused of not doing detail. He's capable of doing detail, but he much prefers the big moments, the big picture. And big moments don't come much bigger than this.
They certainly don't. This has certainly been a big moment in London tonight, and indeed a big moment in Europe. Let's see now if we can take you to Tony Waterman in Brussels. Tony, I want to ask, I wonder, what does Britain's departure from the EU mean for the rest of Europe, not least in financial terms?
Well, this is certainly a big blow for the European Union on many different levels. When you talk about the financial side of things, obviously this is going to leave a big black hole in the budget. The UK is one of the biggest contributors to the budget. It also carries a lot of political clout, not just here in Europe, but globally. And on a psychological level, the entire European Union was founded on this principle of unity. So what we're seeing tonight, now that the clock has gone back past midnight here in Brussels, the UK is gone. This is a complete departure from that unity. So this is on many different levels a very somber event here in Brussels. I have to say that I'm here at the European Parliament, and just 30 minutes ago there was nobody here except a couple of journalists and some tourists. We saw an influx of individuals coming here to be together. We heard some singing, but really everybody kind of sharing this sentiment that this is a somber occasion and not something to be celebrated.
Tony, thank you very much indeed for that from Brussels. Well, Britain's relationship with the EU spans almost half a century. It's been a difficult relationship, rebuffed by France to begin with. The UK joined with enormous enthusiasm in the 1970s, but by the 21st century, the marriage was somewhat flagging. We debacle now on how Britain fell out of love with Brussels.
The UK first joined the European Union's forerunner, the EEC, in 1973. It was an uneasy alliance from the off. Britain, semi-detached from Europe, never fully in. The country rejected closer monetary union with the bloc in the 1990s, and in 2015, Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron attempted to settle the issue within his own party and the wider society with an in-out referendum, the first since 1975.
We are approaching one of the biggest decisions this country will face in our lifetimes, whether to remain in a reformed European Union or to leave.
The vote in 2016 saw Britain's government and major parties back the campaign to stay in, but the people voted to leave by 52 to 48%. And Cameron stepped down the following day.
But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
His successor, Theresa May, was seen as a safe pair of hands at a time when Britain was still coming to terms with the division over Brexit. She called a snap election in 2017, but ended up losing her majority in Parliament. A weakened leader, she was then at the mercy of lawmakers who needed to approve any withdrawal deal with the EU.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432. So the noes have it, the noes have it.
And so after 3 failed attempts of winning support for her deal, an emotional May stepped aside in July last year.
I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
Her successor rode into Downing Street as an avid backer of Brexit, vowing to get the UK out of Europe.
Because we're going to restore trust in our democracy. And we're going to fulfill the repeated promises of Parliament to the people and come out of the EU on October the 31st. No ifs or buts.
Like his predecessor, Johnson soon found his hands were tied by a Parliament opposed to his Brexit deal. In September, he took the decision to suspend the body for 5 weeks, an unprecedented move that was ruled illegal by the UK's Supreme Court. Faced with political deadlock, Johnson called a snap election, the first in December in almost a century. The result was a resounding victory for his Conservative Party, which secured a majority of 80 lawmakers in Parliament. And so, Brexit became a formality. The original deadline of March 2019 was pushed back twice, but the UK is finally coming out of the EU at the end of this month. More than 47 years after this country first joined the EU project, Britain is breaking away and looking to chart its own future in a globalised world. Some will be celebrating the move, others see this as a huge mistake. The issue of European membership may have been put to bed, but those divisions could be a lot harder to heal. Nawid Jabarkil, Cgtn, London.
It's all about trade, it's all about business, it's all about money. I spoke to Patrick Minford, who's a professor of economics at Cardiff University. He was also, by the way, Margaret Thatcher's economic advisor and more recently played a leading role in the group Economists for Brexit. I asked him what risks might come with a future UK-EU trade deal.
Free trade has always been, as a country in our history, our default policy, because we are a trading nation. And I think, therefore, that the position we're in is one that we're used to in our history, and is our natural position, that we are going to get rid of all these barriers that the EU has put between us and the rest of the world. I mean, that is such an opportunity to recreate the economy the way it really should have been all along.
I want to ask you about Boris Johnson's plan to end free movement and introduce this so-called Australian points-based immigration system, and the suggestion that that may indeed reduce economic growth.
No, I think this is nonsense. The fact is that this is a pro-skilled skilled worker immigration system that will get us the skills we need from around the world and stop the free inflow of unskilled workers who have cost us a lot of money because they claim benefits here from the taxpayer and have paid very little tax.
In your view, which industries in the UK will have to readjust the most during this transition period ahead of the UK's departure from the EU?
Well, the thing is, Jamie, you can tell from the squeals coming from the CBI that they don't like the idea of free trade because they've got used to protection. And the EU protects its big industries, which are manufacturing and food, quite heavily, with, we estimate, about 20% equivalent trade barriers that put up prices by about that amount. So those industries in the UK will have to become more productive in order to compete internationally, you know, with world producers who will sell here at world prices. And so obviously for them, there will be adjustment and they will have to raise productivity, but they can easily do it. I mean, our farming sector is incredibly efficient, and so is our manufacturing sector. These sectors have raised productivity massively over the last few decades, and they can do so again in response to the challenge of world competition, which is good for the economy because it'll raise productivity and it'll also release resources that they don't need in those sectors as they raise productivity for other sectors that can expand, notably our very competitive services sector, like the city.
Professor Patrick Minford from Cardiff University. So where will Britain search for future trading alliances apart from within Europe? The United States, of course, and we'll take you to Washington later in the programme for more on that. But a trade deal with China will be high on the wish list. So let's go to Beijing now, where my colleague Zhong She is waiting for us.
Jamie, I am indeed. And there seems to be more waiting down the road before a more independent UK can solidify trade ties with partners, including with China. Now, China has repeatedly said that its role in promoting relations with both the UK and the EU will not change. First, let's take a look at where Beijing and London stand. With economic relations first, China is the third largest exporter of goods to the UK and the fifth largest destination for UK exports. Bilateral trade stood at $61.93 billion in the first 9 months of last year, up almost 1% from the same period of 2018 and continuing a recovery from a steep fall in 2016. In June last year, the two sides officially launched the Shanghai-London Stock Connect, which allows listed companies in one country to raise capital in the stock market of the other. In late January, the UK also decided to let Chinese telecom giant Huawei to continue to be used in its 5G networks, despite pressure from the US to block the firm, although there are some restrictions. Brexit will undoubtedly affect global markets, but the question is, how will this political shift reshape the future of businesses here in Asia? And is the yuan's global campaign going to be disrupted by it? Our Xia Cheng reports.
For China, the European single market was the reason why it chose London as a yuan offshore trading hub in the first place. China is far away from Europe, and it is not really affected by Brexit. So why are we talking about these two, the yuan and Brexit? That's because the UK is likely to lose its status as the European financial center after Brexit. And that could bring trouble to China in promoting its yuan currency in the European markets. The From London to the World strategy.
I don't think there's much to be concerned for China. There are a slight risk regarding Hong Kong, and also the London-Shanghai Connect might be affected because of the Hong Kong issue. But overall, the UK has been holding a very positive attitude towards collaboration with China, even regarding the Huawei issue.
But looking at the data, Jimmy Zhu, chief strategist at Fullerton Research, says the UK's monetary policy is a major downside risk for the Chinese yuan.
So the trend is very interesting. When we look at the sterling and the Chinese yuan, these two, the pattern is pretty in the similar pattern. So in other words, if Bank of England to cutting the interest rate and drive the sterling lower, that probably will also move the Chinese yuan lower. The reason is because of sterling and the other European currency, the weighting in the dollar index is pretty high.
Yet Zhu expects the yuan to outperform major currencies in the first half of 2020. But don't forget the UK's economic picture, as the negative impact of Brexit may start to kick in 2021. That's because the EU has made a case that Britain either accept all the terms on the table, or it has to have a minimal free trade deal by then. That could reshape Britain's trade picture and provide Asia opportunities. Xia Cheng, Cgtn, Beijing.
Let me get you more insight into the situation. I'm now joined in the studio by our independent current affairs commentator, Einar Tangen. and Liu Mingli, Deputy Director of the Institute of European Studies at China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. People have been talking about a free trade agreement between China and the UK. Mr. Liu, let me start with you. How far away are we from that FTA? And do both sides have enough incentives to get it done? What are the challenges?
Yes, after the Brexit, I think there's also plenty opportunity for the two sides to strike a FTA agreement, but not immediately, not before the end of the transition period. We know during the transition period, the top priority for UK is to reach agreement with the European Union. And number two, maybe United States. For China and other Asian economies, I'm afraid it's not on the top list of UK's negotiation list. So I don't think there will be a result very soon.
And negotiations with both the EU and the US might have an effect on its negotiations with China for an FTA there as well. Einar, how should Chinese companies view the UK business environment now that it's no longer a gateway for Chinese companies to sell into Europe?
Well, this is really an offshoot of the kind of me first country idea that Donald Trump started with America first. So it's a very Machiavellian era, and what companies should be looking at is how these FTAs are shaping up. Obviously, the EU, as my colleague has pointed out, is the most important one. But Boris has said he's going to do a dual track. Now, in the background, he gave the green light to Huawei, at least partially. And it seems that he's going to use China as perhaps a card going back and forth. But in terms of specific Chinese businesses, a lot of them should be looking at Britain as some place where they can trade back to China and also to the United States, because regardless of what happens, there will be some sort of agreement between them.
Over the past few years, China and the UK have been trying to increase financial cooperation, where the UK wants to export more financial services to China, where London is serving as a global hub for RMB internationalization for offshore businesses of the Chinese currency. Mr. Liu, will Brexit take a toll on that front?
I think financial cooperation will remain a very important area of cooperation between China and the United Kingdom. Personally, I believe London will remain a very important international financial hub in the future, even after the transition period. And for China, yes, London is the second important RMB offshore center of Hong Kong, and it will remain so, I think, because London will remain the financial center of the whole Europe. So the cooperation will be very important in the future. And for United Kingdom, it's very important for the government to keep the status of the financial center of London, and it will need some international business. And for China, for example, the RMB has the potential to be an international currency in the future. The RMB status does not match China's economy as the largest economy in the world. So there is a lot of need for the RMB business in the future. So that London and China can cooperate with each other. For example, China can put more business related to RMB into the London market.
Einar, what will the economic relationship between China and the EU look like post-Brexit? After all, this will be a big market, a bigger market than that of the United Kingdom.
Well, that's going to continue. Obviously, Europe is looking for business. Economic growth is very moribund. China represents a big opportunity. The real issue is how all these pieces fit together, because you have everybody scrambling for these FTAs. So how you just pay attention to all the details as you're going through. Don't take anything for granted at this point. The difficulty here is that it's very hard to invest in this kind of environment because you don't know the answers. So I think that'll have to wait until later this year.
All right, Einar Tangen, Liu Mingli, thank you so much for coming in today. I appreciate your insight. And while Brexit's uncertainties loom in the economic sectors, the Chinese education industry seems less worried about the impact. In 2019, the numbers of Chinese heading to study in Britain grew 20% to about 100,000 students. And we get this story from Cgtn's Sun Tianyuan.
From London to Liverpool to Leeds, Chinese students are applying to UK universities more and more regardless of Brexit. Applications from China were up by 30% in 2019, according to figures from Britain's Universities and Colleges Admissions Service. And the Chinese student boom is expected to continue.
After Brexit, applicants from the European Union will become international students and will compete with Chinese students for admission spots. Many might be discouraged by tuition, and this might just provide Chinese students more opportunities to apply to better schools in Britain.
Chinese students appear aware of the possible influence of Brexit. Hao Xumeng is a senior at Beijing University of Technology. She received an offer from King's College, London in December.
Brexit might render a fall in the pound. My tuition could be cheaper when converting it from yuan, but there might be a rise in commodity prices and the unemployment rate, so my living expenses could end up higher.
On average, this will save 30 to 40,000 yuan, or roughly 4,000 pounds for each student. Ma Xing says many consider studying in the UK cost-effective and full of opportunities.
The UK has introduced favourable work visa policies to attract more talent to stay after graduation. Chinese students are certainly the largest group to benefit. We are looking at more students and more job opportunities in Britain.
So far, China-UK ties remain largely stable in various aspects. But as my guests pointed out just now, it can't be denied that there's still some level of uncertainty for the future. We'll all keep watching. And that does it for me here in Beijing. Jamie, back to you.
Zhongshe in Beijing, thank you very much indeed. You are watching Cgtn live from London in a country that, as of a short time ago, is no longer a member of the European Union. There were no great celebrations to mark the moment in the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, where most people oppose the move. We will take you there live in just a couple of minutes.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected.
It is and will always remain a matter of deep regret to me that I have not been able to deliver Brexit.
Let this government get Brexit done, or bring a vote of confidence and finally face the day of reckoning with the voters. And yes, they will have an overwhelming mandate from this election to get Brexit done, and we will honour that mandate by January the 31st.
Welcome back to our Brexit special, live from Westminster on the night Britain began a new chapter outside the European Union. Brexit will not be welcomed in every part of the United Kingdom. How to deal with Scotland, which voted to remain and also has a robust movement for independence from the UK, will be one of the many challenges that Prime Minister Boris Johnson now faces. And Northern Ireland is no less complicated. So in just a minute, we'll hear from Andrew Wilson, who's on the Irish border for us tonight. First, let's take you to Scotland and talk to Holly Hudson, who joins us from Edinburgh. Holly, how was the moment of Brexit greeted or celebrated where you are?
Well, there certainly weren't any celebrations here, Jamie. The moment that Britain left the EU was met here with a song, Auld Lang Syne, traditional Scottish song, and chants of independence now, because, of course, Brexit has reignited that age-old debate over independence here in Scotland. It's been a very sombre mood outside Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament building in the capital this evening, because, of course, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU. 62% of people backed Remain, and so that's Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish leader, says is justification for a second referendum. The Scottish National Party are now hoping that they can push ahead with their plans for that, and we've heard messages, echoes from politicians here outside the Parliament today saying that, promising that Scotland will rejoin the EU. They're hoping that Brexit will pave the way for independence and a path to once again become a member of the European Union.
Holly, just for the sake of our international audience, we should explain that the Scottish government is run by the Scottish National Party, which is pro-EU and wants to leave the Union of the United Kingdom. Politically, what can they do now?
Yes, the Scottish National Party, as you say, Jamie, are in the devolved government here in Edinburgh, and their ultimate goal is independence and to rejoin the EU. But the reality is that Boris Johnson and the government in Westminster, the British government, will not let the Scottish National Party break up the UK. They will not allow a second independence referendum. Boris Johnson has formally refused Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish leader's request for another vote, saying that it was a once-in-a-generation vote in 2014. Scotland had their chance back then when 55% of voters rejected independence. But Nicola Sturgeon says a lot has changed since then in the form of the UK leaving the EU, and that is justification. There's also, of course, the option of a non-binding consultative referendum. The Scottish leader earlier didn't rule that out, but did stress that she does want any vote here to be legal and legitimate. So essentially, that leaves the Scottish government here in a sort of constitutional tussle with Westminster. There's a battle between Boris Johnson now and Nicola Sturgeon that is set to go on for some time, and the SNP's only hope really of holding a referendum here and rejoining the EU is that they pile enough pressure on Boris Johnson. They make it unsustainable for the UK government to maintain that position, to keep refusing, keep denying them that second referendum, and the only way they can do that is by winning round more people, getting more support for independence here, and they'll be hoping that Brexit will allow them to do that.
Holly Hudson in Scotland from Edinburgh, thank you very much. Let's talk next to Andrew Wilson, who joins us from Warren Point, one of Northern Ireland's busiest ports on the border with Ireland. Northern Ireland now finds itself outside the EU, but also still in the customs union. Does anyone honestly know how this is going to work in practice, Andrew?
Short answer to that, Jamie, is no. They're calling it regulatory alignment. Now, they call it the Johnson deal, and they welcome the Johnson deal because they now realise there's unlikely to be a hard border on the ground between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But they understand also now that's shifted somehow into the Irish Sea. Now, trade between Northern Ireland and the UK can carry on as normal. And under regulatory alignment, trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU can pretty much carry on as normal as well. But what happens if you're manufacturing a generator in Belfast, but you get your carburettors from Manchester and you assemble them in Belfast, you try to sell those in the European Union? The European Union is going to want to know, they suspect, where that carburetor came from. And you've got to produce the paperwork for that to show that that actually comes from inside the UK, outside the European Union. And then you've got to show paperwork for all the other parts that have been manufactured in Belfast just to make sure there's nothing wrong there. And it's all about regulatory authorities. The Northern Irish here understand the regulatory authorities govern all their machine parts, they govern the food production, but the UK hasn't developed its own regulatory authorities yet, and they're waiting to see if those will be different. They're waiting to see if they're going to end up serving two masters for everything they produce, rather than being able to do things the way they've been done so far in the past 47 years in the European Union. And that is really a big question mark. They're not getting much information out of Westminster, and the mood music is that's because Westminster is waiting to get started on the negotiations with Brussels, and only then will they find out here in Northern Ireland how their fate has been decided. And it's slightly frustrating for them because Westminster, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, is a very far way away.
Andrew, is there any possibility that the end result of all of this Brexit story will perhaps be a united Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland becoming one?
You'd have thought so. There's certainly plenty of reason to think that might be the case. Sinn Féin, the Republican Party here in Northern Ireland, who did pretty well in the UK elections recently, are already calling for a united Ireland. A lot of the infrastructure in and around Belfast and wider parts of Northern Ireland has been paid for by EU grants. So there's a connection there that they may find that's something they would like to continue. And there's this general feeling, of course, with all the clientele and the relationships with the Republic of Ireland, that now is a chance perhaps for that traffic to become more significant than the traffic between the UK. But the trouble is, when you ask people here, they tell you it's not likely to happen. And that's because Northern Ireland has a troubled history. Now, the Republic of Ireland dealt with its problems with the UK back in the 1920s. Their troubles are well over. But the troubles here in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants and between the IRA and the loyalist groups is still fresh in people's minds. And in Dublin, they don't really want to take that on. And also, bearing in mind that there are a lot of subsidies at work here in Northern Ireland, Dublin's not necessarily that clear it can afford to have Northern Ireland as part of its national status. And of course, there are the loyalists here as well, 700,000 or 800,000 of those who are absolutely wedded to the idea of being linked to Westminster and will not countenance any kind of united Ireland. They would then become extremely vociferous politically, possibly even violently, at resisting such a move. So I'm afraid, although it looks like it makes sense through one spectrum, the chance of a united Ireland, I think, Jamie, is still a long way off.
Andrew Wilson on the Irish border, thank you very much indeed for that. And while we've been on air, the Irish Prime Minister has been speaking. He wished the UK well as it embarked on what he called its tryst with destiny, but he warned a lot of tough negotiations still lie ahead between the UK and the EU. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I'm ambitious about the future EU-UK relationship, but I also think we need to be realistic about the dangers. We need to start this new relationship between the EU and the UK on a firm and honest footing, and that means a level playing field. This is very much in Ireland's interests, as well as that of the Union as a whole. So what does a level playing field mean? It means common minimum standards on workers' rights, health and safety, the environment, animal welfare, crucially state aids, as well as product and food standards, and has been the European norm, minimum standards that rise over time, not fall.
The Irish Prime Minister speaking earlier today. So let's now get the view of some of the UK's prospective trade partners. I caught up with Australia's Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, in Davos, and I asked him for his advice to Britain as it leaves the EU.
Look, I mean, these are obviously matters for the people in the United Kingdom to continue to work through. I mean, we, from an Australian point of view, have always fully respected, obviously, that this is a matter for the people of Great Britain. And, you know, we're very confident that the UK will have a bright and fantastic future.
How easy is it going to be? I mean, you've negotiated trade deals. You've represented your country on financial matters. You have great experience in these matters. How easy is it going to be to negotiate these new trade deals? How quickly does it happen? How quickly is it going to happen?
Well, I can only speak for Australia. Certainly, Australia is very committed to conclude a high-quality trade agreement with the United Kingdom very swiftly. With goodwill, there's a lot that can be achieved. I mean, we've obviously got a very strong political, strategic and economic relationship with Great Britain, and we are very much looking forward to concluding a trade agreement very, very swiftly.
How long is that?
Well, you know, again, I'm not going to put a specific time frame on it, but I do believe it can be done very, very quickly. I mean, there's a very good relationship, obviously a long history, and you know, I can't foresee that this will be all that long.
Do you understand why ordinary people in Britain have walked away from the EU? As a politician, do you understand Brexit?
Look, I mean, I'm not a commentator on democratic decisions in the United Kingdom. We fully respect that that is a matter for the people of Great Britain, and the decision is made. A made decision is a good decision, onwards and upwards, and you know, obviously our very best wishes for a bright and strong future.
South Africa is among the emerging economies hoping to expand trade with the UK post-Brexit, as the Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, Nadeli Pandor, told us in Davos.
Well, I think we just had a very interesting UK-Africa summit. And the UK was speaking with a very strong voice, very confident voice, and indicating it sees Africa as an important trade partner, and that they now wish to talk much more about trade with the African continent, and almost implying they feel they've been freed up, or will be after January 31, to make arrangements that they believe will be of benefit to the UK as well as to the African continent broadly. From our perspective, the UK is already one of our very big export destinations. We'd like to see expansion in that. There are areas, for example, in the horse equine industry, where we'd like to do more trade of our horses. But in the agricultural sector, we're doing very well. Again, areas that may have been the domain of rules of the EU may open up for us. These opportunities have already been explored by Minister Patel and the team in Treasury. So already we have a framework which is, I believe, going to be the basis of a future partnership arrangement between the two countries. So we've been proactive. We've been talking to our colleagues in the UK in anticipation of the change, and I think we're well advanced with the framework.
But of course, the big daddies when it comes to global trade deals are China and the United States. The UK is keen to pursue trade talks with the US as soon as possible. So what are the chances? Live now to Washington and Mike Walter.
And Jamie, we're going to talk about that, and we want to focus on the future now. Key decisions and issues that London and Washington will have to resolve. They include, as you just mentioned, trade, intelligence, military cooperation, how to deal with Iran, and how the U.S. relationship with the EU will change as well. But let's begin with Wall Street. It's torn over whether London remains its gateway to the EU market. It's how major banks keep connections with European clients. But as Cgtn's John Terrett reports, the New York Stock Exchange was barely impacted by the political turmoil of Brexit.
Over the 3 years or so that Brexit has been an issue, I think it's very rarely topped the agenda of the traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. In fact, I think I can count on the fingers of one hand, probably fewer even, the number of times that Brexit has actually driven the markets here in New York. Now, they were very interested when it first happened, but then I think attention rather waned, and they were interested again last year in 2019 when the issue became the story of the day. But always, always, there have been other issues which these markets have been wrestling with alongside Brexit, such as the impeachment of the president and the ongoing trade war with Beijing. I think it is fair to say that many Americans struggle to understand the complexities of Brexit and the relationship between Britain and the European Union. On more than one occasion, I've been asked by people here, why is it that Prime Minister May can't get her bill through Parliament? What is the ERG group, the European Research Group? And what is the relationship between the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission? Now, I will tell you that to a man and a woman here on the floor of the exchange, they cannot understand why Britain wouldn't want to be free of the European Union and able to make trade deals with the rest of the world. Now, markets are forward-looking instruments, so we will see now, as the possibility of a trade deal between London and Washington looms, negotiated between Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the President, whether or not the issue of the Brexit ramifications will bubble to the top of what people think of as important news stories here. For today, though, while you might like me to tell you that there was a Brexit bump or even a reaction the other way. It simply isn't true. All eyes were on the coronavirus issue, with the White House giving a news conference just before the market closed. At the end of the Friday session, the Dow was down 2%, the S&P 500 by 1.7%, and the Nasdaq down by 1.5%, though the Nasdaq is up for the week and the month of January. John Terrett, Cgtn, on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Joining me now is my colleague Nathan King, and also a guest this hour, Garrett Martin. He's with American University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome, gentlemen. As John was alluding, it's really been a slow news day. Coronavirus, impeachment, and then this silly little thing. Last hour, you showed us your passport. Things have changed. 47 years, the divorce official now. What does that mean for this?
Well, there's a little line. It's well worn because we travel a lot here at CGM. But there's the word European Union up here.
Yeah.
That's no longer valid. In fact, the passports that are coming out are going to have no European Union at the top. And we used to have these big blue ones. I think you've seen them in the James Bond films. There's sort of nostalgia to go back to those, but, you know.
And Garrett, we've talked before about, in fact, we've talked about how this is a story that has a beginning and a middle and never seems to have an end. But we are there now. Your sentiments on this special day?
Well, there's certainly a sentiment of finality. It was very symbolic and somewhat emotional for those who were disappointed with the outcome to see the Union Jack being lowered. That being said, being Irish, I'm going to quote the Irish Prime Minister Taoiseach saying, "It's not over. It's really only half-time for Brexit," to use a sports metaphor. There's some hard negotiations ahead. It might not be quite as dramatic as what we saw in the last 3.5 years, but I think Brexit is far from complete or far from over.
And you said it's the end of the beginning last hour.
Yeah, but can I just say something? This is personal for me. My grandmother, on my mother's side, fled the Spanish Civil War, and she came to London. My grandfather fled the Second World War after the Vichy government from France, and ended up in London. We are European. And to me, this, I don't want to get on the side of who's right and who's wrong, but to me, we're a European family, and to see this break up is very emotional for me.
Well, and that's a good point, because you've got some people who are cheering right now, but others, obviously, some tears over this whole...
Absolutely, and I think that's also going to be a story we can't forget. It's also about ordinary citizens. And really, families, people have been really torn apart in the last 3.5 years. And the fallout from Brexit, even within the community of the United Kingdom, between, we saw the reactions in Scotland that were very vigorous and very disappointed. That's going to take a long time to be able to put these pieces together. And so we shouldn't lose track of the human element. It's the high drama of politics. But it's also very tragic for many ordinary citizens.
It is also obviously the first step in this relationship now between the United States and the UK. Is a very special relationship. Already Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying, hey, we're going to get to work on a trade deal. But there seems like there might be some choppy waters there. Let's listen to what he had to say about negotiations.
Sure, it'll be complicated, and there'll be places that'll be very contentious. Both negotiating teams will want to preserve things for their own country. That's how negotiations work. Look, we're committed to working on this as quickly as we can. I don't want to put a timeline on it. It'll take a little bit, but I hope by the end of this year or the late summer, early fall, we have a substantial piece of progress.
Complicated and contentious. Garrett, why don't you take a stab at that?
That is the greatest understatement when it comes to trade negotiations. If I had a pound or a euro or a dollar for whenever someone has said it will take a year to complete a trade agreement, that is completely far-fetched in my view. There's an electoral reality in the US of 2020, and the United Kingdom simply does not have the negotiating bandwidth or the experience, in my view, to pursue both a complicated negotiation with the EU and with the US. So the idea that we're going to complete an agreement by
Japan, China, everything. I mean, it's quite incredible. Pompeo was being nice there, because they know they had to be nice to the Brits this week. Essentially, this is what the Trump administration wanted, was Brexit. But essentially, the boxing gloves get put on the day after Brexit. And the Trump administration see a real opportunity here of basically Americanizing the British economy. Now, there's been a lot of talk about putting the National Health Service on the table. That won't happen, but incrementally, as opposed to having a European style economy. And there's a lot at stake here, especially for the British who think perhaps they're going to, take their power back, to actually negotiate with a much larger economy. And they're going to feel this elsewhere as well. And I'm not just talking about the two biggest economies like US and China. I'm talking about Japan. I'm talking about, you know, the EU as a whole. It's going to be very, very cold out there. And you have to ask, you know, I'm a patriot, you know, as a Brit. I love this country too. But what does Britain in the 21st century have to offer the world that you can't get anywhere else? That's a really interesting question.
That's a really interesting question.
Football?
And Garrett, football. We'll go with football.
I mean, you know, but
it's interesting. You know, Trump may be a supporter, but even in agreement, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said we may not pass it if this has anything to do with the Good Friday Agreement. So you've got to get through the House and the Senate as well. It's a very complicated road ahead, isn't it?
It's incredibly complicated because trade agreements have always been an area where there is domestic residence. And we've seen that with the USMCA, that Congress and, you know, the House has some strong interest in what it wants to see in an agreement. Anything that smacks of affecting the Good Friday agreements would be an utter no-no. We saw reaction to the deal over Huawei this week. So there are going to be some domestic pressures on the United States for any agreement. And then I fully agree with Nathan as well that there's an asymmetry as well. The UK needs a trade agreement with the United States far more than the other way around. Absolutely. And so, you know, they already have limited tariffs. What the UK would be interested in is access to public procurement in the United States. I don't really see that being on the table.
You brought up Huawei. Mike Pompeo also talked about that. Let's listen to this, and then we'll finish up by talking about Huawei. Let's listen.
We just need to make sure we understand it. We understand the systems. We are evaluating exactly what the United Kingdom's decision was on Tuesday of this week, and I am very confident that our two nations will find a way to work together to resolve this difference and deliver on behalf of our two people world-class, secure technology and infrastructure.
I like how he does resolve this difference. In other words, kind of squeeze your arm to one of these.
The language 2 days before the decision was worse. I mean, literally, it was like, we made the Five Eyes, you know, intelligence sharing is a risk. They even pressured the Australians to fly in, who, of course, have excluded Huawei, to lobby their colonial, former colonial masters. It was a full court press. And then suddenly, when they decided, okay, well, Huawei can have about 35%, and we may wriggle a bit because we may lose some money, but essentially a good decision for Huawei and costs. Pompeo's like, oh, we'll work it out. Which is a really interesting point, because if, you know, the UK and the US are always meant to have this special relationship. Pompeo did not say special relationship once on that trip. And, you know, now people can look at Britain and say, well, we can do what we want as well. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, well, gentlemen, thanks so much. It's going to be very difficult to straddle both of these worlds. That's going to be a negotiating tactic that Boris Johnson's going to have to really master. Our special coverage, Brexit, a new era, continues now from London, and my colleague, Jamie Owen.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. Welcome back to Westminster. Now, if you were with us earlier in the programme, you might have seen my colleague, Cgtn correspondent Richard Bestick, disappear mysteriously into the crowd. We lost touch with him, but I'm hoping after disappearing and going AWOL, we've managed to track him down. Richard Bestick, are you there? You were with the crowds. What was that moment like of Brexit?
Well, Jamie, you saw the excitement there. Thousands of Brexiteers partying in Parliament Square like there was no tomorrow. And for the European Union, of course, there is no tomorrow. They were waving Union Jack flags. They were singing 19th century songs about Britain ruling the waves. They were triumphant. They were very happy indeed. And some of that overflowed when I tried to talk to you earlier. The speeches came from a number of different people. It came from a number of, I think we've got another visitor with us now, Jamie. It came from people like Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Brexit party, and for the last 21 years, a leading person in the campaign to take Britain out of the European Union. There were shouts triumphantly of, we've done it, and the excitement continued. As you can see, the police lines are still up, but the crowds have dissipated, and you can hear that they simulated their own Big Ben bongs there, because the real Big Ben is being renovated at the moment, and nobody could, not even Boris Johnson could get that. Boris Johnson is an intriguing figure in this whole event. There was a crowd of Brexiteers went to the end of Downing Street and were chanting Boris, Boris. And it's, you've got to ask yourself whether, without Boris Johnson, whether Britain would be leaving the European Union, and whether the country would be down an entirely different path. He is a major player, and he has created a change that we won't see, because we're now entering this transition period with no negotiations going on for 11 months, but ultimately real change has been brought, Jamie, to British society.
Richard Bestick, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's taken 3.5 years since the referendum to get to this point, to get to tonight, but the debate has been raging, of course, for much longer than that. Our correspondent Nigel Farage looks back at some of the key moments that have led to Brexit.
Britain's departure from the EU ends a relationship that has spanned 5 decades. The UK joined what was then the 6-member European Economic Community in January 1973, a decision that was ratified in a referendum 2 years later. The ever-expanding grouping became the EU in 1994, but many Conservatives were unhappy with its broader political focus and moves towards closer union. So, in June 2016, Prime Minister David Cameron called the referendum resulting in a narrow majority for what quickly came to be known as Brexit. But the details, well, they were still to be worked out. In March 2019, the first of several Brexit deadlines passed as Cameron's replacement, Theresa May, tried to get her Brexit deal through Parliament. When Boris Johnson took over last summer, he set his own deadline of October 30th, but that too passed without agreement. And it was only after he won a majority in December's election on the slogan, "Get Brexit Done," that he was able to break the deadlock.
Well, let's have our last word tonight with our special guests, Git O'Harry, former advisor to Boris Johnson, and Helen Thomas, a Downing Street veteran and former advisor to the UK Finance Minister George Osborne. How will today be remembered, do you think?
It's a moment of truth. We've argued for decades about whether being part of Europe is a good thing or a bad thing. We will soon find out. Not tomorrow, not in the next few months, but we have now taken a sort of step that we can't easily go back from. We can't change our mind tomorrow morning. You know, getting back in at this point would be a huge effort. So we're about to discover whether a country, even a country with an economy that's the 5th or the 6th largest in the world, can actually stand on its own 2 feet, whether you're less influential when you haven't got allies, when you haven't got colleagues, when you're not plugged into a big institution or not. And a lot of this is riding on the personality and the character and the self-belief and the national belief of one man, Boris Johnson. Huge responsibility, huge challenge. If he pulls it off, he will be a great historical figure. If he doesn't, he'll be a great historical figure, but in an extremely negative way.
Helen, Brexit has preoccupied the political classes for 3 years now. For normal people, let's call everyone else normal people, ordinary people, that terrible journalistic phrase, for normal people, how will tomorrow be any different?
I think there'll be a great sense of relief, frankly, that we're moving on, whether it may be to some regret of some people and to the joy of others, and move on to many more things that consume people. Actually, you know, we look at this footage tonight, of jubilation and sadness. But the truth, I think, in a very British, somewhat understated fashion, is actually, can we just get on with it? And you know what? Even if you have a bad plan, but it's well executed, that's better than a good plan poorly executed.
Let's talk about the future of the EU. Is Brexit simply a ripple that the EU will simply absorb, or is it a wave that's going to wash through the whole of Europe?
It's a very good question, and we've talked a lot tonight about divorce. What happens when somebody gets divorced? All their friends get a little bit nervous. They're all watching. Most married people want the person who's got divorced to have a miserable time in their little bedsit somewhere else. They don't want them to be happy. And if Britain can show that we can break free, that we can enjoy influence and economic success without this burden of the Brussels bureaucracy, then it could be a devastating, destabilising effect on a whole load of other European countries that are already very lukewarm, if not hostile, to a lot of what's imposed on them by Brussels.
And a final thought on politics. What does Brexit and 2020 say about the state of British politics?
It says that we're prepared to take a leap into the unknown. Very unusual for the long lineage of the history of Britain that we talked a lot about tonight. Actually, despite some of our reserve nationally, we have taken this big step, and as Guido was saying, we can't go back now.
Thank you both very much for keeping me company on a cold night in January that's now become February. Good to see you both. Thank you very much indeed. From here in Westminster, our special coverage, let's recap some of the key moments. The UK has left the European Union after nearly 5 decades of membership. The Brexit hour has been met with celebrations in London and across the country by supporters. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has hailed the departure as a new dawn for Britain. But there were protests and vigils in the British capital and elsewhere by those who wish to remain part of the European Union. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, asked Europe to leave a light on for Scotland. The UK flag has been lowered in Brussels, where European Union leaders said they would work hard on good relations with their departing member. And that is just about it from this special edition of Cgtn, live from Westminster on the day Britain left the EU. We will be back in just a minute with a Facebook Live from Westminster, but we will leave you tonight with some of the extraordinary scenes from these momentous events. From all of us here, thank you for watching and goodbye. Yeah, absolutely.